Well, a very good evening. You're watching the press preview. It's our first look at the front pages, and tonight we'll check out those headlines with the Chief Executive of Conservative Home, Mark Wallace, joined by Moya Lothian-McLean, the politics editor of the magazine gal-dem. Great to see you both. We'll chat in a second after we've taken a look at some of those front pages. Let's start with the Times. It says ministers are expected to approve the easing of more restrictions on May the 17th, which will include being able to hug friends and family from other households for the first time in more than a year. The Telegraph also focusing on May the 17th, with the ban ending on foreign travel, meaning people can go on holiday abroad this summer, it says. Daily Mail next, launching a campaign on its front page to help create a memorial to honour all of the victims of coronavirus at St Paul's Cathedral. TV shows cancelled as harassment claims grow. That's on the front of The Guardian, referring to allegations made against the actor and movie producer Noel Clarke. The FT leading with the Eurozone falling into a double-dip recession in the first 3 months of the year as a third wave of coronavirus took hold. And the Star poking fun at the Prime Minister as it's revealed Boris Johnson's personal mobile phone number has been freely available on the internet for the last 15 years. The Mirror's front page, meanwhile, focuses on the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge boycotting social media this weekend. It's all part of that campaign against online racial abuse. And I'm joined tonight by the Chief Executive of Conservative Home, Mark Wallace, and Moya Lothian-McLean, politics editor of the magazine gal-dem. Great to see you both. Thanks for being with us this Friday evening. Moya, let's start then, shall we, with the front of the Times. In fact, all the front pages, I've got to say, really have got very positive news, and it's about time, isn't it? We had something to smile about as we head into the bank holiday weekend. The headline, the Times, is going with "Hug Friends in a fortnight," and this is all because the vaccine rollout is going so well. Things look good for May the 17th.
Yes, it's great, and it leads with this amazing picture, which is from Liverpool, which is 3,000 revellers in a docked warehouse, and I only wish I was there, to be honest. So the people who turned up to this event, they needed to have a negative test within 24 hours of attending, and it's part of a 2-day event as part of this pilot scheme, which is to test how they can safely reopen mass events such as clubbing, big sporting events, etc. It looks amazing. Everyone looks so happy. So this is just positive news. There's not much else to say about it other than things are going well for once, and the vaccine rollout is actually ahead of schedule, which is brilliant. I think next week they're planning to get onto the people in their 30s, which is amazing. So, you know, for once we've got this good news. It's great, but we have to wait and see what happens after this event in Liverpool. So they'll be doing a follow-up test 5 days after the event. They say they're measuring the air at the event, but at the moment, I think only 1 in 1,000 people in Britain have COVID currently. So finally, tentatively, things are looking up.
Mark, are you a big clubber? Fatboy Slim is on tomorrow night, I'm being told.
Is he? Well, you know, I'm not, but as much as it's a privilege to be here at the press preview, I too would rather be there with 3,000 people, partially just for the novelty of actually being around other people who aren't part of my immediate family.
It almost looks quite surreal, doesn't it? I mean, it's like looking back at something from history, really.
Yes, I think we probably all had that experience where you turn on the TV and you're watching a show that was obviously recorded before COVID, and people start kind of hugging each other and kissing each other on the cheek, and it gives you a slightly strange reaction after the weird conditioning we've all had in the last year. It's going to be so good just to start to get rid of all this stuff and to be able, fingers crossed, as long as trials like this work out, as long as the vaccines and variants continue to go in the right direction, that we'll be able to start getting back to our lives, and most of all, being social people and social beings who can, you know, hang out with and enjoy each other's company.
Moya, something else that's going to hopefully change on May the 17th is the ban on holidays, and the Daily Telegraph says that too is looking very positive. Yeah,
so before we were warned that there'll be no foreign travel this summer, none at all. But now this looks like it might be rolling back. So they're announcing that there's a ban on foreign travel ending on the 17th of May. We'll be operating under a similar traffic light system that we had before. So there's the red list, there's the amber list, there's the green list. And there'll be, different countries will have different levels of warning. So that will still mean quarantines, that will still mean checks. The only thing that I would say could be a spanner in the works for this is there's been warnings recently from airport officials that border control in the UK particularly is not prepared, and queues are becoming absolutely untenable thanks to COVID checks, which is obviously something we have to go through. But the fact it's not sorted out yet, and I would argue probably throughout the whole of the pandemic, hasn't really been addressed in the way it should be. At the start, we didn't have proper COVID checks. Now we do. It's not efficient. So that poses a bit of a problem. And then there's also questions that were raised last year when we had the sort of red list, amber list, green list about the division between the good and the bad countries that doesn't necessarily reflect caseload. For example, there were countries on the red list that had less cases than the US, which wasn't put on that list. So there'll be questions raised about how certain countries get on certain lists and whether there might be a diplomatic influence there as well.
Yeah, you're nodding along there, Mark. I mean, the airline industry, the travel industry, absolutely on their knees. They need this to happen. I think we all need this to happen, but it's not going to be necessarily plain sailing, and there will be a lot of bureaucracy. There'll be testing. There'll be issues at airports. There's still some way to go.
Indeed, of course, as we all know, if we do carry on, fingers crossed that we do, in succeeding in this battle against COVID within the UK, the important next stage is making sure that we don't then accidentally bring in, for example, yet more variants. We've already got a number of troubling variants in this country. One of the interesting things, as you were just saying about the way in which the industry's been affected, I recently did an interview with Grant Shapps and with some kind of major figures in the airline industry. There's a lot of stuff going on in the background, I think. For example, reducing the cost of tests. One of the big things is, well, you might be able to fly, but actually you could end up spending more on tests than you do on flights for your whole family at the minute. They're doing a lot to reduce the cost of testing, and it's also going to be quite interesting, exactly as Moya just said, to see exactly how they decide who goes on what list. And that includes hints from Grant Shapps that we will see a return of the island scheme that we saw last summer. So some countries that could be on the red list, if there are island destinations that are part of those countries in a different situation with COVID, they may get an exemption.
Yeah, I think we're expecting to hear from Grant Shapps a news conference sometime next week. Let's move on to inside of the Times, page 2 of the Times. This has been so difficult, Moya, hasn't it, for people with relatives, with loved ones in care homes. But finally, thank goodness, restrictions there being eased as well. Care home residents will be allowed to visit friends and families, albeit outside, without having to isolate when they get back.
Yeah, I think this has been one of the most difficult aspects of the pandemic for people affected. So thankfully, finally, residents will be able to leave their care homes to visit a friend or a family member's garden, go on walks in places such as parks, public gardens, beaches. They'll need to be accompanied by a staff member, but they won't need to isolate. And they can't go inside except to go to the toilet or to vote. But 71% of care home residents now have the vaccination. And one of the things that has been so hard is the isolation that care home residents have experienced. From the very beginning, there was that horrific period at the start of the pandemic when care home residents, were being discharged from hospital without being tested. And that was when the virus absolutely ran rampant through care homes. So that was a terrible period of fear. They've been locked up. A lot of these people they're elderly people. Some of them suffer from, memory loss, dementia-like conditions, which only worsen when you're separated from their family. And I did a story very early on in the pandemic about how so many care homes didn't have accessibility in terms of Wi-Fi. They didn't have internet connectivity. So the things that we even use to keep in touch with our loved ones, these video calls, this digital stuff, that just wasn't there. The infrastructure wasn't there in so many care homes. So this is just a lifeline. But I think we should also remember that for so many people, it's come really, really late, and it's devastating.
Yeah, it really is. Away from coronavirus, Mark, let's finish this half with a story on the front of the FT. Now, this is concerning Charles Dunstan, the founder of Carphone Warehouse, of course, quitting as Downing Street steps up what they say is a cultural cleansing campaign.
I think I'm right in saying that it's a critic from the museum sector who says it's a cultural
right. Yeah, critic. Yeah.
It's a bit of a tasteless term I probably wouldn't use on this, but this is part of an ongoing kind of rumbling story we've seen in the last few months, where there have been a number of these cases where people who are public appointees, or government appointees, or state appointees to the boards of public bodies haven't been reappointed. And there seems to be a kind of air of shock that the idea that somebody's already on a board, how could they not be reappointed for the next term? Whether it's in, say, Channel 4, or whether in this case in the museum sector, where there's a lot of debate about kind of the politics of culture and museums. I've got to say, frankly, I'm glad to see the government taking a little bit more of an active role in doing what it's meant to be doing with these appointments, which is being the shareholder or the representative in these bodies of the people who actually fund them, in whose name these bodies exist, which is they are public institutions for the people. And that means that you can't just have an automatic culture of, well, you're already there, you should be reappointed. And I think, frankly, it's good that we're seeing a bit more challenge. I'd like to see more transparency from government on how it makes these decisions. But I'm quite glad to see there isn't just a kind of carry on as you were culture going on.
Moya, what's your take on this?
Well, I disagree. I mean, in that story on the FT front page, it's literally a leading Tory says there's an expectation that members of a board should have a similar attitude to that of the government. And I don't think that our public institutions should all have to, the trustees who are charged with making sure that these places are successful, that they have this pluralistic approach, and that their representatives should all have to have a similar attitude to that of the government. We wouldn't expect that of a Labour government. We shouldn't expect that of a Tory government. There should be a diversity of opinion and approaches. And I think more questions need to be asked about how people like Oliver Dowden, the Culture Secretary, are making these decisions and who exactly they're penalising in ensuring they don't get second terms. There's names like Mary Beard, and the person they're talking about in this story, which is Animal Huck, they apparently have been sacked, and they are a trustee whose academic work advocates decolonising the curriculum, which is something that many prominent Tories have been very opposed to in recent years. So I think we do have to ask more questions about how these decisions are made.
OK, we must leave that there. Thank you both for the moment. Coming up, has the Prime Minister really not changed his phone number for 15 years? Find out after the break. Welcome back. Part two of the press preview. Conservative Home's Mark Wallace is still with me. Moya, I think we're struggling the connection, but there she is. Hello, welcome back. Good to see you both. Mark, let's just start with you. In the Times, red wall blues to deepen in former Labour heartlands, all referring to the elections next week. Now, despite 3 investigations into the flat refurbishment, potentially a 4th, a number of investigations into the Prime Minister personally as well, it seems that the Tories are going to do really well next week.
It certainly seems to be pointing that way, particularly in some of these red wall areas. And remember, the elections next week, we've had a big break in the democratic process because of COVID. We've got this huge heap of different elections: Wales, Scotland, mayoralties in London, in Manchester, in Liverpool, in Tees Valley, in the West Midlands, as well as the Hartlepool by-election and the council elections. There's a huge amount riding on it next week. And what this poll seems to reveal is that the detail of the polling is worse for Labour than the headline. So we've all seen the Tories kind of maintaining their lead nationally. But if you look specifically at the red wall, it's much worse for Labour than that, because actually Labour is piling up votes in London, for example, in some parts of the south and a few parts of their former heartlands. But in those places that in 2019 fell, it helped to make this big majority of 80 seats. It seems like Labour, if anything, has slipped further behind among some of those former lifelong Labour voters who they've lost, who they were really hoping to win back.
Moya, in December, Labour had a 4-point lead over Conservatives. This week, Labour is 11 points behind. Why is that, do you think?
I mean, there was a poll that came out, I think, about 3 weeks ago, done in the Red Wall heartlands, which seemed to pin a lot of the blame, sadly, on Sir Keir Starmer himself and the fact he's not cutting through with the voters there. So for several reasons, it appeared, I think voters said that they didn't know what he stood for. They felt like he hadn't led enough. So I know that Keir has been very cautious over the last year because it's difficult to lead as an opposition during a pandemic, he would argue. And I know that the party has argued this, but it seems like it's not enough. So there needs to be a serious rethink on the part of the top Labour brass about where they go from here. I know in this Times story, there's a senior MP quoted, who is on the Labour left, we should say, that Starmer should consider stepping down if it becomes clear he's not making enough progress in these red wall areas. I don't know if we're even there yet, but I know that whatever the party is doing, it seems like they're throwing a lot of stuff at the wall, but they're still not making the connection with the Labour heartlands. And I think it's very telling that recently they let go of the entirety of their community organising unit, who will be finishing in May, whereas it seems like what they need is that community organising in these heartlands, because something is not connecting.
Moya, I'm going to leave that there because I just want to do the last 10 seconds, Mark, on Boris's phone number. Tell me about this.
Well, yes, this is the revelation in the last couple of days that actually you could potentially find Boris's phone number online or an old press release. I've got to say, I think that's probably the case for an awful lot of MPs. The gold thing that you don't want to give up in Westminster, as in so many walks of life, is your number, because it's how people can get hold of you. And now, at last, he's been forced to change it.